Richard Lawson was a man who had everything most people could only dream of. He owned a chain of successful hotels, drove the best cars, and lived in a huge mansion surrounded by tall gates and perfectly trimmed gardens. But despite all the wealth and success, his life at home was quiet. Almost too quiet. 2 years ago, Richard's life had taken a sudden turn when his only daughter, Emily, was in a terrible car accident. She had been only 16 then, full of energy and dreams, always. Dancing around the house, the accident left her paralyzed from the waist down. Overnight, the bright and cheerful girl he knew became quiet, withdrawn, and spent most of her time in her room. No amount of money could buy back the life she had before. Richard tried everything to bring a smile back to her face. He brought in therapists, personal trainers, and even famous dancers to visit, thinking they could inspire her. But nothing seemed to work. Emily would politely listen, but her eyes stayed distant, as if part of her spirit had faded away. One bright spring afternoon, Richard returned home earlier than usual from a meeting in the city. He walked into his mansion and was about to head upstairs when something caught his eye through the large glass wall of the sunroom. Outside in the garden, he saw Emily. She was in her wheelchair, her hands held by a boy he had never seen before. The boy was thin, wearing clothes that looked worn out and a bit too big for him. His hair was messy and his shoes were scuffed. Yet there was something about him. He was moving with such lightness and joy, guiding Emily's wheelchair in smooth, playful circles as if the two were dancing. Richard froze in place, his heart pounding not with fear but confusion. Who was this boy? How had he gotten past the gates in security? And why did Emily look happy? Her head was tilted back slightly, her eyes closed, and she was smiling. Not the polite smile she sometimes gave to please him, but a real, glowing. The smile he hadn't seen in years. Richard stepped outside, his shoes crunching against the gravel path. As he approached, the boy noticed him and stopped moving instantly. He let go of Emily's hands and stepped back, his expression nervous. "Emily," Richard said firmly, his voice carrying the tone of a father used to protecting his child. "Who is this? What is he doing here?" Emily turned her wheelchair toward him, her cheeks flushed. "Dad! This is Jake. He's my friend." "Friend," Richard repeated, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the boy. "How did he get in here? The gates are locked during the day." Jake swallowed hard before speaking. "I didn't come to cause trouble, sir. I just wanted to dance with her," Richard frowned. "Dance? You broke into my property for that," Emily quickly spoke up. "Dad, please don't be mad at him. He didn't break in. He comes through the side path near the fence. I told him it's okay." "Emily, that's not," Richard began, but she interrupted, something she rarely did. "Dad, please listen. Jake comes here almost every day when you're at work. He dances with me, and for a little while, I feel normal again." The words hit Richard harder than he expected. Normal. He knew how much Emily missed her old life, but hearing her say it like that made his chest feel heavy. Still, he wasn't ready to simply accept this stranger in his backyard. He turned to Jake. "Where do you live? Who are your parents? Do they know you're here?" Jake hesitated, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I don't really have a home, not anymore." Richard's suspicion deepened. "What do you mean?" I sleep at the shelter near the old train station," Jake admitted quietly. "My mom passed away last year and my dad left before that. Street sometimes to earn some money for food." Richard was silent for a moment, processing the boy's words. Emily's eyes pleaded with him. "Dad, he's not dangerous. He's kind. He's the only one who makes me laugh again." Jake nodded, his voice almost a whisper. "The first time I saw her, she was sitting here by herself, looking sad. I had my little speaker with me, and I played a song while dancing on the sidewalk. She smiled at me through the fence. So I came back the next day and she was waiting. We just went dancing together." Richard didn't know how to respond. This boy, who had so little, was giving his daughter something that all his money couldn't buy a reason to smile. Still, couldn't ignore the fact that Jake was a stranger. He straightened his shoulders and said, "All right, Jake, you've told your story, but you can't just wander onto private property. Things don't work like that." Emily's voice cracked slightly. "Please, Dad, just let him stay a little longer. It's just this once." Richard looked at her. He hadn't seen her eyes shine like this in a long time. He let out a slow breath and said, "Fine, but only for today. After that, we'll talk about it." Jake's face lit up with relief, and Emily grinned, turning her wheelchair back toward the garden. The boy picked up the small speaker from the ground and pressed play. Music filled the air, soft and cheerful, and he began moving again, guiding Emily in gentle spins. Richard stood there, arms crossed, watching. At first, he told himself he was keeping an eye on them to make sure nothing happened. But as the minutes passed, he found himself simply watching. The way Emily's laughter bubbled out when Jake spun her quickly, the way Jake seemed to forget his own hardships for a moment. It was strangely moving. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt a small smile tug at his lips. He didn't understand it fully yet, but something told him this meeting was going to change more than just Emily's days. It might change all of their lives. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink. Emily's laughter echoed in the garden, and Jake's movements grew more playful. Richard stayed until the music ended, feeling a quiet warmth in his chest. He didn't know what he was going to do about Jake yet. But one thing was certain: this was no ordinary boy, and this was no ordinary friendship. The next morning, Richard sat at the long wooden table in the dining room, his coffee growing cold as he thought about what had happened the day before. He could still picture Emily's face, her cheeks glowing, her eyes sparkling as she laughed. With that boy Jake, that smile had been gone for so long that it almost startled him when it appeared again. But he was still troubled. He didn't like the idea of strangers entering his property without permission. He had security cameras, guards, and high fences for a reason. Yet he couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, this boy was different. Emily rolled into the dining room, still in her pajamas, and greeted him with a light "good morning." "Morning," Richard replied, putting down his cup. "Emily, about yesterday." Her expression immediately tensed, as if she was expecting him to ban Jake from coming again. "I'm not angry," he said slowly, "but I need to understand something. Why didn't you tell me about him before?" Emily looked down at her hands. "Because I knew you wouldn't understand. You've been trying so hard to make me happy with all these people you bring here. Therapists, dancers, coaches, but it's different with Jake. He doesn't make me feel like a patient. He treats me like a normal person." Richard's heart tightened. She was right. He had been treating her carefully, maybe too carefully, as if she might break. "Where did he even learn to dance?" Richard asked. Emily smiled faintly. "Told me he used to watch people dance in the park when he was younger. Then he started copying their moves. He's not trained, but he's amazing." Later that afternoon, Richard made a decision. He asked his driver to take him to the old train station area, where Jake had said he stayed. The place was rough walls, with peeling paint, litter in the streets, and the sound of cars rushing by in the distance. He spotted a small shelter with a faded sign outside. Sitting on the curb with a small speaker by his feet was Jake. He was moving his hands in time with the music, lost in his own little world. "Jake," Richard called out. The boy looked up in surprise, quickly standing to his feet. "Mr. Lawson." "I didn't come to your house today because I thought maybe I'm not here to scold you," Richard interrupted. "I want to talk." They sat down on the steps of the shelter. Richard asked him more about his life. Jake told him about his mother, who had been a waitress, and how she passed away after a long illness. His father had left years before that, and with no other family, Jake ended up at the shelter. "I earn a little money dancing on the street," Jake said. "Sometimes I play songs on my speaker and people give me coins. I don't make much, but it's enough to buy food." Richard listened quietly. He noticed the boy didn't complain, didn't ask for pity. He just stated facts. "Why do you spend so much time with Emily?" Richard finally asked. Jake shrugged. "Because she's my friend, and because I know what it feels like to be alone. I don't like seeing her sad." The answer was simple, but it hit Richard hard. He had been trying to fix his daughter's sadness with expensive solutions, while this boy had simply given her time and friendship. Before leaving, Richard handed Jake a paper bag from his car. "It's just some food," he said. Jake hesitated, but then accepted it with a quiet thank you. The next day, Richard told Emily that Jake could come by, but only if Richard was home. Emily agreed happily. That afternoon, Jake arrived. With his little speaker and a bright smile, they danced in the garden again, Emily's wheelchair spinning in smooth turns as Jake guided her. Richard sat nearby, pretending to read the newspaper but really watching them. He began to notice small details. The way Jake slowed down when Emily's hands got tired. The way Emily leaned forward in her chair to match his movements. The way they laughed at the smallest mistakes, turning them into part of the dance. After the song ended, Richard called Jake over. "Did you go to school?" he asked. Jake shook his head. "I stopped last year. It was too hard to keep up while moving between places, but I'd like to go again. Someday." Something stirred in Richard's mind. He didn't say anything yet, but a plan was slowly forming. Over the next week, Jake came almost every afternoon. Sometimes they danced. Sometimes they just sat in the garden talking. Melly told Jake about the books she loved, and he told her stories about the people he met on the streets. Richard noticed how much lighter Emily seemed now. She even started joining him for breakfast again instead of eating in her room. One evening, after Jake had left, Richard stood by Emily's door. She was humming softly to herself, the same song Jake had played earlier. He smiled to himself and thought, this boy has done something no one else could. But he also knew that if Jake was going to be in their lives, he needed more than just afternoons in the garden. He needed stability, safety, and a chance to build a future. Richard was a man who believed in action. And he had already decided, though Emily didn't know it yet, that he was going to do something that would change Jake's life, just like Jake had changed theirs. The next few days passed with a quiet rhythm that felt new to the Lawson household. For so long, the mansion had been filled with silence, Emily keeping to her room, Richard burying himself in work, and the staff moving quietly through their duties. Now every afternoon, music floated in from the garden, followed by the sound of Emily's laughter. It was a strange kind of music. It's not the polished songs that usually played in the mansion, but lively street tunes, cheerful beats mixed with Jake's own clapping and stomping. It's the kind of music that made you smile, even if you didn't know the dance. Richard would often stand near the glass wall of the sunroom, pretending to go through papers while watching them. Emily's face would light up as Jake moved around her chair, guiding her hands into simple motions. When she got something right, Jake would cheer loudly. Emily would laugh like she had when she was a little girl. The more Richard watched, the more he realized this wasn't just about dancing, it was about confidence. Emily was beginning to talk more, to look people in the eye again. She seemed excited each morning, asking the staff if they thought Jake would come that day. One evening, after Jake had gone, Richard found himself thinking about the boy again. He thought of the way Jake spoke, never asking for anything, never complaining. He remembered what Jake had said about not going to school anymore. That part bothered him. A boy his age should be learning, building a future. Not worrying about where his next meal would come from. The next day, Richard asked his driver to make some calls. He wanted to know if there were any good schools nearby that offered programs for students who were behind in their studies. He also made a call to a small guest house on his property that had been empty for years. It was meant for visitors, but hardly anyone ever used it. In the afternoon, when Jake arrived, Richard greeted him at the gate instead of letting him slip in through the garden. Jake looked unsure at first, but Richard smiled. "You don't have to sneak in anymore. You're welcome here." Jake's eyes widened. "Really?" Richard said. "Come on, Emily's waiting." They spent that afternoon not dancing, but sitting in the shade of the big oak tree in the garden. Emily was telling Jake about the places she wanted to visit one day: Paris, Rome, maybe even New York. Jake listened with a half smile. "I've never been anywhere," he admitted. "But if I could, I'd like to see the ocean. I've only seen it in pictures." Richard, sitting a little distance away with his coffee, made a mental note of that. A few days later, Richard decided to test Jake's interest in learning again. He brought out an old book on famous dancers and handed it to him. "Thought you might like this," he said. Jake flipped through the pages carefully, as though afraid to damage them. "I don't know all the words," he admitted quietly. "I read a little slow." "There's no shame in that," Richard said. "It just means You haven't had the right help yet." Jake nodded, but didn't say more. Still, Richard noticed the boy carried the book with him when he left that day. That night, Emily wheeled herself into her father's study. "Dad," she said softly, "you're thinking about helping Jake, aren't you?" Richard looked up. From his desk, "I am. But I need to know it's what he wants too." Emily smiled. "He won't say it, but I think he dreams about having a normal life again. You should see the way he looks at the school buses when they pass by." The next afternoon, Richard asked Jake to walk with him around the property they'd stopped in, front of the small guest house. "I was thinking," Richard began, "this place has been empty for years. It's warm, safe, and close to the main house. If you stayed here, you wouldn't have to live at the shelter anymore." Jake stared at him, almost in disbelief. "You'd let me live here?" "On one condition," Richard said. "You go back to school. I'll take care of the fees and supplies. You'll have a proper place to sleep, proper meals, and you can still come dance with Emily every day." Jake's voice was quiet. "Why would you do all that for me?" Richard hesitated before answering. "Because you've done something for my daughter that I couldn't. You've brought her joy again. And I believe people who give that kind of gift deserve a chance too." For a long moment, Jake didn't speak. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. "If you're sure, I'd like that. I'd like that a lot." That evening, Emily was overjoyed when her father told her the news. She hugged Jake from her chair and he laughed, a little embarrassed. "Guess I'm your neighbor now," he said. The next few days were busy. The guest house was cleaned and furnished. Jake was given new clothes, shoes, and school supplies. A tutor came to help him catch up on his studies before starting the new term. But even with all these changes, the afternoons in the garden stayed the same. They still danced, they still laughed. And Richard still found himself watching from the sidelines, feeling grateful. One evening, as the sun set and the air cooled, Richard stood by the oak tree, watching them practice a slow routine. Emily's movements were more confident now, her hands graceful as Jake guided her chair in a gentle spin. It struck Richard how natural it all seemed, to young people from completely different worlds, finding common ground in something as simple as music. And for the first time in a long time, Richard felt like his home was alive again. He didn't know what the future would hold for Jake. But he knew one thing: this was only the beginning. "If you want, I can move on to part 4 next, where Richard makes the surprising public decision that shocks everyone in their community." That's where the emotional peak of the story really starts. Do you want me to continue? The weeks that followed felt like a fresh season in the Lawson home. The once quiet mansion was now filled with music, conversation, and an energy Richard hadn't felt since before Emily's accident. Jake settled into the guest house quickly, almost as if he had always belonged there. Every morning, he would head off with his tutor to study, determined to catch up on all the lessons he had missed. In the afternoons, he would be back in the garden with Emily, their laughter echoing. Under the tall oak tree, even the staff, who had at first been unsure about having a homeless boy living on the property, now greeted him with smiles and friendly banter. Richard noticed how seriously Jake took his studies. One evening, passing by the guest house, he saw the lights still on and peeked in through the window. Jake was bent over his books, lips moving slightly as he read, determination on his face. It warmed Richard's heart to see that the boy wasn't wasting the opportunity he had been given. But Richard also knew that he wanted to do something more, something that would not just give Jake a place to stay now, but would open doors for his future. One Saturday morning, Richard invited both Emily and Jake to join him in the sunroom. On the table in front of him was a neat stack of papers. "I've been thinking," Richard began, leaning forward, "about how much both of you have changed in the last few months. Emily, I've seen you smile more than I have in years. Jake, I've watched you work hard at your studies, never once asking for more than what you were given." Emily looked curious, while Jake shifted in his chair, unsure where this was going. "I've spoken to the principal of the Hamilton Academy of Performing Arts," Richard continued. "It's one of the best schools for music and dance in the state. They've agreed to give you a place, Jake Kahn, a full scholarship. You'll get professional dance training, academic education, and all the resources you need to build a real career." Jake's mouth fell open. Wait, you mean me? At that school? That's for real dancers. You are a real dancer, Richard said firmly. You just haven't had the chance to train like one, and now you will. Emily let out an excited gasp. Jake, that's amazing. Jake was still stunned. I don't know what to say. I've never even been inside a school like that. Then it's time you did, Richard said with a smile. Your classes will start in 2 weeks. Until then, you'll keep working with your tutor so you're ready. And of course, you'll still be here with us. For a moment, Jake's eyes looked glassy, as though he might cry, but he quickly blinked and nodded. Thank you, Mr. Lawson. I don't know how I can ever repay you. Richard shook his head. You already have. You gave my daughter something priceless, her happiness. This is my way of saying thank you. Word about Richard's decision spread quickly through the neighborhood. People who had once looked down on Jake as just another street kid now spoke about him with admiration. The story of how a homeless boy had brought joy to a paralyzed girl's life was now getting the chance to study at a top school seemed to touch everyone who heard it. The local newspaper even called Richard asking for an interview. Richard agreed, but insisted that the article focus on Jake's talent and hard work, not just his hardships. When the piece was published, it painted a beautiful picture of resilience, kindness, and second chances. But it was Emily who was the happiest of all. She began helping Jake prepare for his new school, reading him dance history books, helping him memorize terms, and even making small playlists of songs he could practice with. On the last weekend before Jake's first day at the academy, Richard decided to hold a small gathering in the garden. He invited close friends, neighbors, and some of Emily's old classmates. The lawn was decorated with soft lights, and a wooden platform was set up for dancing. When everyone had arrived, Richard stood up to speak. I wanted to thank you all for coming. Tonight is not just about good food and company, it's about celebrating how unexpected friendships can change lives. Jake, when you first came here, you were a stranger. Today, you are family. The crowd clapped warmly, and Jake looked down, a little shy but clearly touched. Richard then gestured toward the platform. Emily and Jake have prepared something for us. I think you'll all enjoy it. The music began a gentle melody that soon built into a lively rhythm. Jake moved with natural grace, guiding Emily's wheelchair in smooth arcs. She lifted her arms in time with the beat, her hands flowing in shapes that matched his steps. It wasn't just a dance, it was a story. A story of meeting, of friendship, of lifting each other up. By the time the song ended, the garden was silent. For a moment, and then applause erupted. Some guests were even wiping their eyes. Emily's smile was brighter than the garden lights, and Jake's face glowed with quiet pride. As the evening wound down, Richard stood at the edge of the garden. Watching the two of them laugh together, he knew there would be challenges ahead. School would be demanding. Life was never predictable, but he also knew that whatever happened, Jake now had a foundation he could build on. And deep down, Richard felt grateful not just for what he could give, but for what he had received in return. The reminder that sometimes the most valuable treasures in life were not bought, but found in the most unexpected ways. The first morning at the academy felt like the start of a new chapter for everyone. Jake woke early in the guest house, nervous and excited at the same time. Put on his new uniform carefully, smoothing the fabric as if to make sure this moment was real. He checked his backpack twice, then looked in the mirror and took a deep breath. Down the path, the mansion windows glowed with soft light. Emily was already awake, waiting near the front door, with a small handmade card she had made. For him the night before, on the front she had drawn a pair of dancing shoes and a small wheelchair side by side, both surrounded by music notes. Inside, she had written, "For my friend who makes the world move. You can do this." Richard drove them to the academy himself that day. It felt important. When they arrived, the campus looked both beautiful and intimidating. Wide halls, tall windows and posters of past performances lining the walls. The sounds of piano keys, counted rhythms, and soft footsteps filled the air. Students walked past with dance bags and careful posture, moving with the quiet confidence of people who knew why they were there at the office.
Ow.
The receptionist smiled as she handed Jake a schedule. His first class was ballet basics, followed by music theory, then English, and later a beginner contemporary dance session. "You'll do fine," she said gently. "Everyone starts somewhere." Outside the door to his first class, Jake paused. He could hear the teacher's voice inside, steady and clear. He looked at Richard and Emily. For a moment, his hands trembled. Emily reached out from her chair and squeezed his fingers. "One step at a time," she said. "I'll be right here when you come out." Jake nodded and went in. The room smelled faintly of wood and rosin. A row of mirrors reflected the class back at itself, making everything look larger, brighter. The teacher, a woman with kind eyes and a calm tone, introduced him to the group. "This is Jake. Welcome him." A few students smiled, some curious, some friendly. The class began with simple positions and slow counts. At first, Jake struggled to keep up with the names and shapes. But he had something stronger than training. He had love for movement, a natural rhythm, and a clear reason to try. By the end of the class, sweat dampened his collar, but his eyes were shining. When he stepped back into the hallway, Emily cheered softly from her chair. Richard clapped once, a proud, quiet sound that meant more than any speech. "It didn't fall," Jake said with a laugh. "And I learned something new." Days turned into weeks, and a routine formed. Mornings began with class and study. Afternoons were a mix of practice and tutoring. Evenings brought the familiar comfort of the garden. Jake's feet learned to listen to counts. His arms learned shapes. His mind learned the patience needed to break big dreams into small steps. He made mistakes, he made progress, kept going. Emily, too, found something new in this season. She started joining an adaptive music group online, learning to play simple melodies on a small keyboard Richard bought for her. She worked with a physical therapist twice a week, not to walk again, but to build strength and confidence in her upper body. She learned new movements that helped her control her chair with more ease. In the garden, Jake adjusted every routine to include her chair like a partner, not a burden. The dances were never about what she could not do. They were about what they could do together. People in the neighborhood continued to talk about the story they had read in the paper, but the Lawson family didn't pay much attention to the noise. They were busy living the next part of the story. Sometimes, after dinner, they sat on the porch and watched the sky turn gold, then pink, then blue. Emily would tell jokes Jake had heard 100 times, but he laughed anyway. Richard would listen, his heart full in quiet ways that didn't need words. One afternoon, the academy announced a spring showcase. Each student would perform a short piece, and friends and family were invited. Jake felt his stomach flip when he saw the poster. He wanted to be part of it, but he worried about being good enough. His teacher noticed his nerves and spoke gently. "Confidence grows when you put yourself where growth can happen," she said. "You've been growing every day. This is just a chance to share it." The idea for his piece came easily. He would dance with Emily if the school allowed it. He asked the director, who listened carefully and then smiled. "We value stories that bring people together. Make a plan. Keep it safe. Show us your rehearsal next week." Jake worked with Emily every day in the garden, choosing a soft melody that swelled into something hopeful. They crafted simple, beautiful shapes. Jake stepping forward as Emily's arms traced a ribbon in the air. Emily turning her chair while Jake circled around her. The two of them pausing, holding a moment of stillness that spoke more loudly than any step. The first time they rehearsed in the academy studio. The mirrors reflected not a wheelchair dance, but a dance, a real one. The director watched and nodded, eyes bright. "Yes," she said. "This will speak to people." As the showcase date approached, Richard quietly did something else. He met with a few trustees and local donors and proposed an idea. A small scholarship program for students who needed help, students like Jake, along with a new inclusive arts workshop held once a month at the academy. The workshop would invite students with different abilities to try music and movement in a welcoming space. He offered to fund the first year himself. The trustees voted yes. The director sent him a thank you note with a single line that made him smile. "This is how we build a kinder stage." Showcase night arrived with a hum of excitement. The auditorium filled with parents, friends, and neighbors. Emily waited backstage with Jake, her chair carefully aligned to the marks on the floor. She wore a simple dress in soft blue, and Jake wore a white shirt and black pants. "Are you ready?" he whispered. She nodded, calm in a way that surprised them both. When the lights dimmed and their music began, the stage became a small world of trust. Jake stepped into the opening phrase, and Emily's hands rose in answer. They moved through the shapes. They had practiced again and again, but something new lived between the notes tonight, a quiet, shared courage. When the music paused, they held the stillness together, two figures framed by light. Equal partners in a story only they could tell. When the final note faded, there was a heartbeat of silence, and then the audience stood. The applause washed over them like warm rain. Jake bowed, then turned and bowed toward Emily, and she lifted her hand in a small wave, smiling with the kind of joy that had no hurry and no doubt. Backstage, the director hugged them both. "Thank you," she said. "Simply, you reminded everyone what art is for." The days after the showcase were filled with small celebrations and new plans. Jake received a handwritten note from one of the Academy's senior instructors, inviting him to join a summer dance intensive. He also began volunteering at the first inclusive arts workshop, helping younger children experiment with movement and rhythm. He was patient in a way that surprised even himself. When a little boy in a walker said, "I can't," Jake knelt and said, "Maybe not that way. Let's find your way." Emily found her voice too. She spoke at the second workshop, telling the group about fear and friendship and the power of trying. Her words were simple and soft, but the room leaned in to listen. She showed them a few arm movements from the showcase, and a dozen little hands reached up to copy her. Afterward, one girl rolled her chair close and said, "I want to dance. Like you." Emily took her hand. "You already do," she said. Richard watched these moments with the same quiet pride he had felt in the hallway on Jake's first day. He noticed how the house felt different now, fuller, kinder, more alive. He cooked on Sundays sometimes, even if the results made everyone laugh. Still worked hard, but he didn't miss dinners. He made time for porch talks and piano practice. And late-night tea, spring turned to summer, and on the first warm weekend, Richard surprised them both. He had planned a small trip, nothing fancy, just a 2-day drive to the coast. He remembered what Jake had said about the ocean. He found a beach with a smooth boardwalk and a wide, firm path that led down to the sand. When they arrived, the air tasted like salt and sunlight. The waves rolled and curled, white foam reaching and falling. Emily's chair moved easily along the path. She lifted her face and closed her eyes, listening to the sound of water that never stopped. Jake stepped onto the wet sand and slowly began a simple dance, letting the rhythm of the tide set his pace. He laughed when the waves chased his toes. Emily clapped softly, the breeze carrying her applause away in pieces. They spent that afternoon doing nothing important and everything that mattered. They ate sandwiches with crumbs that the wind stole. They took photos that didn't need filters. They said very little, because some days speak for themselves. As the sun began to lower, painting a path of light across the water, Richard stood beside them and tried to hold the whole sight in his heart. The boy who had once danced for coins, now dancing for the sea. The girl who had once watched from a window, now rolling toward the edge of the world without fear. The father who had once tried to fix everything with money, now learning how to give the one thing that matters most, time and steady love. On the drive back, Emily fell asleep with her head tipped gently against the window. Jake watched the coastline, disappeared and said, "Thank you for today." Richard kept his eyes on the road and said,